Hello, I am Helen Romero from Bachelor of Secondary Education major in English, and my topic is about the American Republic and the contemporary period, regionalism and cultural independence. But before I start, here are my objectives. First is to provide inputs about American Republic and the contemporary period, regionalism and cultural independence. Next is to discuss the information regarding the topic and to understand through the details and gathered research provided in this report. So what is American Republic? The American definition of republicanism was itself unique. Republic or res publica means simply public thing, a decidedly vague notion that might apply to any regime other than a monarchy. In the 10th Federalist, James Madison defined republicanism as representative government. That is, by a specific way of constructing the country's ruling institutions and a recognizable form beyond not monarchy. From the design of the Virginia House of Burgesses to the Articles of Confederation and finally to the Constitution itself, representation provided Americans with real exercise of self-rule, while at the same time avoiding the turbulence and folly of pure democracies, which had so disgraced themselves in ancient Greece that popular sovereignty itself had been dismissed by political thinkers ever since. Abraham Lincoln's Lyceum Address shows how republicanism must defend the rule of law against mob violence. Even the naming of Lincoln's parties as the Republican Party was intended to contrast it with the rule of slave-holding plantation oligarchs in the South. America was a natural rights republic, limiting the legitimate exercise of popular rule to actions respecting the unalienable rights of its citizens. It was a democratic republic with no formal ruling class of titled lords and ladies or hereditary monarchs. It was an extended republic, big enough to defend itself. The American contemporary period questions the goodness of humanity, explores human consciousness, and upends social norms. Discover the period's divergence from modernism, the effects of World War II on the American literary landscape, and the pressures of conformity in the post-war consciousness. In the development from modernism, Hemingway, Gertrude Stein, and T.S. Eliot, leading modernist writers, taking place between the 1920s and 1940s. They explored the ways that truth is not straightforward, rational, or clearly defined, but rather how it is completely influenced by human perception. Next is the effects of World War II. The massive trauma of World War II influenced contemporary writers. Throughout the end of modernism, people were dealing with the horror of World War II. The bombs dropped on citizens in Dresden, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki left the world traumatized, wondering if there was any point to human existence, whereas modernist writers really began to explore human consciousness as a primary mode of getting at truth. The contemporary writers following the war also struggled to reconcile the irrational and violent actions taken by humans. The last is the response to conformity. Not only were writers dealing with the beginnings of this sort of existential crisis of purpose and meanings, they were also confronting absolute and unquestioned patriotism, which continued in America after World War II. During the war, national pride had been galvanized in order to defeat the German and Japanese armies. After the war was over, media and popular culture identified the U.S. as the prime hero of the time. Americans were the good guys who do no wrong. Regionalism and cultural independence. That was the relationship between the U.S. and Europe for a long time until the Great Depression of the 1930s. With this economic crisis emerged a new artistic movement, one which embodied nationalist and isolationist attitudes of a country looking to withdraw from an international community that had recently fought a world war and was now an economic peril. This movement was regionalism. In many ways, by rejecting European art rather than emulating it, America was growing up. So what is the definition of regionalism in literature? Local color or regional literature is fiction and poetry that focuses on the characters, dialect, customs, topography, and other features particular to a specific region. Influenced by Southwestern and Down East humor between the Civil War and at the end of the 19th century, this mode of writing became dominant in American literature. Subgenre or movement of the larger American literary movement of realism, flourishing in the late 1800s, yet surviving even now. Harper Lee is an amazing author in her book To Kill a Mockingbird, and special because it was the only book of hers to become published other than the sequel that was written later. It was published in 1960 and does not fall in the time period. However, it still shows regionalism in American literature. It follows a little girl named Scout and her father Atticus Finch, who defends a black man in a trial for his life. This book depicts the struggle of African Americans and the things they faced. The theme of the book is to show the distraction's innocence. Harriet Beecher Stowe from 1811 to 1896 is best known for her novel Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852, which depicts the harsh conditions for enslaved African Americans. The book reached millions as a novel and play, and became influential in the United States and Great Britain, energizing anti-slavery forces in the American North, while provoking widespread anger in the South. Uncle Tom's Cabin was the best-selling novel of the 19th century and the second best-selling book of that century, following the Bible. It is credited with helping fuel the abolitionist cause in the 1850s. In the first year after it was published, 300,000 copies of the book were sold in the United States, 1 million copies in Great Britain. The impact attributed to the book is great, reinforced by a story that when Abraham Lincoln met Stowe at the start of the Civil War, Lincoln declared, "So this is the little lady who started this great war." The book was an anti-slavery novel that helped to bring down the stereotypes of blacks in this era. Regionalism and cultural independence. Cultural independence proved to be the hardest area for Americans to break free from European models and standards. In 1780s, Noah Webster declared that America must be as independent in literature as she is in politics. By the 1830s, over 60 million copies had been sold and its descendant, Webster Dictionary, remains a mainstay of American bookshelves. The most popular writers of the post-revolutionary era wrote strongly patriotic accounts like Mercy Otis Warren's History of the Revolution in 1805 and Mason Weems' fantastically popular and distorted account of George Washington's life that sped through countless editions stating in 1800. Philadelphia writer Charles Brockden Brown, arguably the most sophisticated novelist of the New Republic, the first American writer to receive both popular and lasting acclaim, was the New Yorker Washington Irving. His most famous stories drew on Dutch American popular culture in his native state and gave audiences such classic characters as Rip Van Winkle and the Headless Horseman. In 1826, James Fenimore Cooper wrote and published one of the classics of American literature, The Last of the Mohicans, a French and Indian War epic that ingrained the nation's romantic and tragic perspective of the plight of Native Americans, emphasized the wilderness and its central role creating America. American cultural innovation was both original and thoughtful during the early Republic and early national periods. Its most influential contributions generally focused on subjects that distinguished the United States from Europe, like the work of the great naturalist painter and engraver John James Audubon. At the beginning of the 19th century, all Americans, particularly painters and writers, were struggling with the notion of what it meant to be an America. Much current criticism now reads both 19th and 20th century regionalism as always global and cosmopolitan, intricately enmeshed in circuits of trade and diverse cultures, in ways that believe its pretense at being merely local in conception and subject matter. The concept of critical regionalism imagines political life in the present. It thinks about issues of place, bodies in place, and knowledges derived not only via textuality and discourse, but from place as a critical location, an orientation, and the material structure. Critical regionalism is a way of diagnosing the new configurations of meaning, time and space occasioned by global restructuring and new technologies. It is a political and cultural imagination and a mode of embodiment whose keywords and ethical domains are under construction. So, what are the characteristics of regionalism in literature? First is setting. It emphasizes frequently on nature and the limitations it imposes. Settings are frequently remote and inaccessible. The setting is integral to the story and may sometimes become a character in itself. Second is characters. Local color stories tend to be concerned with the character of the district or region rather than with the individual. Characters may become character types, sometimes quaint or stereotypical. The characters are marked by their adherence to the Old West, by dialect, and by particular personality traits central to the region. In women's local color fiction, the heroines are often unmarried women or young girls. Next is the narrator. The narrator is typically an educated observer from the world beyond who learns something from the characters while preserving a sometimes sympathetic, sometimes ironic distance from them. The narrator serves as mediator between the rural folk of the tale and the urban audience to whom the tale is directed. The last is plots. It has been said that nothing happens in local color stories by women authors, and often very little does happen. Stories may include lots of storytelling and revolve around the community and its rituals. And that would be all in my report. Thank you.